Hey, welcome back today where by Expo 2. We're gonna listen again to a podcast of Diary of a CAO with a nice doctor that has so much interesting things to say. They call him Dr. K.
I think it can be, sure.
Loneliness.
Loneliness is a great example of a signal that's designed to connect with you. What about something like anger or fear? Why do we have fear?
To warn us against impending danger?
Absolutely, right? So if I'm like running through the jungle and I see a tiger and I have fear, fear gives us information, and what else does it do?
Gives us a physiological energy and
Very
reaction,
good.
adrenaline.
Absolutely. For what purpose?
To flee.
Absolutely. So this is a big thing that people don't understand. The primary motivator for change is actually negative energy, a negative emotion. So this is the problem with venting. If you vent and get rid of all of your negative emotional energy, the drive to change will disappear. So if we kind of think about it, what motivates you the most? It's actually negative emotion. And you can literally look at the neuroanatomy of things like the amygdala. So the amygdala is very close to the hippocampus, which is where learning and memory happen. So we actually learn the most through negative emotions. So if I've been happily married for 15 years and there's infidelity, right? One case of infidelity. The negative emotion from that one case of infidelity can drastically motivate me. So one of the biggest problems that I see is that we try to get rid of our negative emotions, and in doing so, we actually hamstring our motivational capability. So I've seen this a lot where people will come in and they'll go through like what they think therapy is, which is like, actually same guy, Mike, came in and he'd like kind of talk about his problems. And I was like, bro, Mike, is this helping? So I was still a trainee at the time. So he'd been seeing me for about 6, 8 months. And I was like, you come in here and you kind of talk about your problems, but like you don't seem to be getting better. I didn't know how to do therapy at the time. And then he's like, isn't that what I'm supposed to do, is come in and talk about my problems? I was like, yeah, I think so. I was a second-year psychiatry resident, but I was like, is this helping? He's like, no. And I was like, okay, we got to do something else then. Coming in and just venting is not actually psychotherapy. That's not like, so talking about your problems, reducing your negative emotional energy can actually keep you stuck. And if you pay attention to people in your life, you'll notice that there are some people who just like bitch all the time, right? They're just like constantly complaining, they're constantly venting, and they don't actually do anything to change their life.
It's interesting because with the advent of social media, you now get reinforced by deficiency promotion, I call it. There's kind of these two types of ways that you can build an audience or a personal brand. One of them is idea promotion. These are my ideas. This is how I think about something. And the other that's emerged, which is really interesting and a little bit toxic, is like deficiency promotion. These are all the ways that I'm broken. These are all the ways that I'm inadequate. And you can build an entire audience around that, which resonate with your inadequacies. And then that inadequacy, that you get held there. Because that's the speaking appointments you get booked to do. That's what your book's about. Your book is about all the ways you're broken and flawed, all the stuff you've been through. And then it becomes your profession. And I watched that play out so many times. I'm like, I talk to my friends about it. I'm like, be careful of deficiency promotion, because you might accidentally build a revenue stream there and then you're fucked.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we see is that there's a lot of empathic resonance, right? So, and I think in some ways that's a good thing. So I think when I'm a broken human being, there are a lot of broken other human beings. The problem is when you're a broken human being, you don't feel like you're a part of society. You're like broken and everyone else is out there living their lives and being positive. And so it can feel so relieving to connect with someone else, to realize, oh my God, I'm not alone, right? So I think with some of these deficiency promotion, and we see that a lot in like psychotherapy groups on trauma and stuff like that, where there's a lot of like trauma bonding, and there's also some weird ego there with like, I'm more broken than you and my trauma is worse than you, a lot of toxic comparison. There's a lot of stuff that can kind of go awry. But I think there's absolutely a reason why that's a way that you can build your brand, because there are a lot of people out there who feel broken and feel alone. And I'd rather be broken and with someone than broken and alone.
It's all about belonging at the end of the day.
Yeah.
All of these things are about, feeling like you belong.
Absolutely.
What role does dopamine play in all of this? Because we talked at the start about taking back control, but much of the reason, as I learned from Andrew Huberman, that it's hard to gain control is because many of us are in this sort of dopamine roller coaster in our lives.
Yeah, so I think dopamine plays an important role, but the one thing that I've really come to appreciate is that how little of a role it plays. So everyone is like hung up on dopamine. But dopamine, first of all, is a neurotransmitter, right? So dopamine is also like deals with things like smooth movement. So my ability to go like this is governed by dopamine.
You were waving your arm.
Yeah. Just like so like anytime you have a smooth motion. So if we look at something like Parkinson's disease is a deficiency of dopamine. So there are all kinds of things that dopamine does. I'd say dopamine is like a letter in the alphabet for the brain. We use it in all kinds of circuits to create all kinds of behaviors. So dopamine is absolutely important. We'll talk about it. But I think that there's almost like too much of an emphasis on dopamine, and we oversimplify the problem when we focus too much on dopamine. I'll give you a really simple example of that. So one is, in my clinical experience, it's almost like dopamine and serotonin have an inverse relationship. So dopamine is what gives us a sense of pleasure. Dopamine also gives us behavioral reinforcement. But dopamine gives us pleasure, but will not give us contentment. So I've had plenty of patients who chase dopamine, right? And we know that, partying a lot, using a lot of drugs, having high adrenaline activities that all activate your dopamine system don't usually leave people feeling fulfilled and contented at the end of it. I've had plenty of millionaire playboys in my practice who tried that to find happiness and maximize the pleasure in their life, and it doesn't work. It's never going to work. And the problem with that is that our brain has this principle of tolerance. So the more that you activate your dopaminergic system, the more tolerance you'll develop to it. This is why people need higher doses of drugs to achieve the same goal. This is why people, when you first play a video game, it's a lot of fun. But hour 5, 6, 7, 8, it becomes less and less fun. And then you have old gamers like myself who are still chasing the beauty and the high of the games that we used to play when we were kids. So dopamine is almost like a scam neurotransmitter because it offers you pleasure temporarily, but in an unsustainable way. On the flip side, we have serotonin. So serotonin is associated more with contentment and peace. When we look at things like mood disorders, oftentimes what we're doing is improving the serotonin level, boosting the serotonin transmission in the brain. So peace and contentment is very different from pleasure. And these two things are almost inversely proportional and it's really interesting, you can look at something like orgasm, which is a great example of this. So when you have an orgasm, you get a spurt of dopamine and you feel a ton of pleasure. And then after your orgasm, you actually get a rise in serotonin and you feel incredibly contented. The really interesting thing is that if your serotonin levels are high, you won't feel horny. So what'll happen is we know this because if we give someone serotonergic medication, if we boost your serotonin transmission, one of the side effects is anorgasmia and you can't have an orgasm. And then you also aren't as sexually, you're not as thirsty, okay? So this is one of the side effects. This is one of the number one reason why my patients stop serotonergic medication. It has to do with the sexual side effects. But if we kind of think about the neurotransmitters involved, right? When we boost serotonin, and we also see this in monks who are super content and peace and they're not very thirsty, right? So if we kind of think about it, peace and happiness and contentment in life comes from serotonin. Dopamine is actually kind of the opposite. And monks aren't thrill chasers, right? They're able to develop this internal sense of contentment. So dopamine is absolutely a part of the problem. It's a very important part of the problem. But I think that it's one piece in a larger whole.
Does this explain why people's sex lives typically get worse when they're comfortable and they're married?
Absolutely. It's amazing how much science can tell us about the formation of relationships and falling in love that we just don't apply. So being attracted, falling in love, developing a relationship, these can discretely be described neuroscientifically. So being attracted actually starts in the thalamus. So the thalamus is our sensory organ of the brain. It's kind of the sensory gateway. So it interprets a lot of sensory stimuli. So when I first meet someone, I'm like, oh, they look really good, right? It looks really fantastic. And I feel physically attracted to them. They smell great. Their laugh is beautiful. So the initial stages of attraction are all about sensory input. Then what happens, now this is what's really interesting. Falling in love is actually very dopaminergic. So this is one of the reasons why I think we're seeing declining birth rates. This is why it's if you talk to people nowadays, it's hard to fall in love. Everyone's dating, everyone's going out on dates and stuff, but falling in love seems harder. And that's actually because of dopamine. So what happens is if you look at the phase of falling in love, what that involves is a dopaminergic connection. And a great example of this is if we're going to dinner, right? And I put my hand out, Stephen, hold my hand. And then we're gazing into each other's eyes and we're just holding hands. and then we feel in love. And if you kind of think about people in love, like it's like a dopaminergic high because that's literally what's going on. Now what you see, if you go to a restaurant and you people watch, which I love to do, what you'll see is two people on a date, both on their phones. So what's starting to happen is we are like developing this dopaminergic tolerance through things like devices. We're actually exhausting our dopamine, which is something that a lot of people don't understand. We run out of dopamine because we're using these devices, and then we have none left to fall in love. And then there are later things in the relationship that are more serotonergic in nature, where it's not as much about pleasure, but it's about connection and all kinds of other stuff.
So what does that mean if I'm single and I'm looking to find love?
So if you're looking to find love, this is where we have to start with diagnosis before solutions, right? So the first question is, do you have trouble falling in love? Because a lot of people who are single are like, oh, like, I don't feel anything, right? I don't feel a connection. This is something that I've heard so much from our community, so much from patients anymore. I just don't feel a connection. They seem great on paper, but I just don't feel a connection. There's actually neuroscience behind how to form a connection too. But what the first question that I ask people is, okay, do you feel like you just can't feel an emotional connection to people? Then what you actually need to do is reduce your dopamine activation through things like cell phones. We see this also with pornography, where we know that pornography correlates with like unhappiness in relationships. And that's probably also like a dopaminergic effect as opposed to all the other things. There's a lot of stuff going on there. So play fewer video games, be on your phone less, and especially before you go on a date, you want to like give your dopamine a chance to recharge. So go on a walk for about 1 hour before you go on a date, and then your brain's capacity to engage in a date and fall in love and activate those feelings is going to be higher. Also, I'd avoid as much dopaminergic activity as you can before the date, before you see that person. And the more that you do that, the easier it will be for you to actually fall in love.
Am I right in thinking from what you said there that dopamine is required for us to initiate sex and want to have sex? Is that what you were saying?
Yes and no. So dopamine is not actually required to initiate sex. It's so fascinating. You can so I tried to figure this out. Like how does love work in the brain? It's like every circuit is involved. Every neurotransmitter is involved. So dopamine is what gives us the pleasure of orgasm. But initiating sex, also for men and women, is somewhat different. So women will say like, oh, foreplay is really important, right? And dudes are like, we don't need a whole lot of that. And so the question is why? So this is what's really interesting. So to develop an erection, you actually need activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of our nervous system that involves rest and digest, which is why we have morning wood, right? So when dudes wake up in the morning, we have an erection. Why? We're not like horny in the morning. Well, I don't think so anyway, maybe, who knows? But like there's a physiology to it, right? Where when we're relaxed, we'll develop an erection because the development of an erection actually involves relaxation. And then the sexual act involves transition to the sympathetic nervous system. Now this is the fight and flight kind of response. So what we want to do is we want to be relaxed first, and then we start getting sweaty, our heart rate increases, blood pressure increases. And this is the other thing that a lot of dudes don't understand because our nervous system is a little bit different. So when it comes to women, they have the same thing going on where they need activation of the parasympathetic nervous system before they get activation of the sympathetic nervous system. And then as you activate the parasympathetic nervous system with something like a massage or making out or something like that, some playfulness, relaxation, people really need to feel safe. Then you can sort of graduate to the more explicit sympathetic nervous system sexual act.
This has answered so many questions that I had that I've never sort of vocalized because I didn't realize the issue. But I have come to learn that I am most aroused when I'm not stressed in any way. But I don't just mean stressed as in like, oh, stressed. I mean, if it's Friday night and I've just come back from work and I've got home at 9 p.m. after a really, really long day and week, I am not aroused typically. So what tends to happen, and like we know this in my relationship, and it's the same for my partner, is on like Saturday, once I've had time to relax and I've like chilled down and I've all those kind of things, then I get aroused. And there is this, I think, misunderstanding between men and women because we get aroused in different ways.
Absolutely. Once again, like we're seeing so many problems in relationships, so many problems in dating. And what happens is women will get branded as all kinds of she's an ice queen or whatever she won't put out. And there's a lot of toxic misogyny there. And then men will also get branded as oh, men only want one thing and they're so horny, which can somewhat be true. But I think this is the kind of thing where once you understand, how does the male body work? How does the female body work? What are the ways? Because the majority of it is actually very similar. So like what separates men and women is less than what we share. So if you look at, for example, like how to create romantic attraction on a first date, like there's a lot of good like neuroscience data about things to do.
You watch the full podcast of the show on Diary of a CAO. You can learn so much. I'm gonna post another a few pieces of it of the podcast. It's so interesting, and I hope you like, subscribe, and comment. Bye bye.